Hi, and welcome to the DataBasement podcast. Today, I'm excited to talk to former colleague, friend Tarik, who's a staff security engineer at Meta, where he focuses on threat intelligence and vulnerability management. He's also held roles such as security researcher, incident response engineer, and many others, and has been in the cybersecurity industry for over a decade now. Hey, Tarik, how's it going?
Yeah, Dan, it's good to see you again. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. So one of the things we like to do on the show is to learn the origin story behind the person, and everybody that finds themselves in cybersecurity typically has a fairly unique experience. So why don't you tell us a little bit of like, where did you start your career and how did you find yourself in cybersecurity?
Yeah, I love this question. And I agree, like everyone's got such a fun, unique story. And I think mine's kind of fun too. So like when I was a kid, my mom one day, I was like 8 years old, and my mom just like got me a computer. She's like, Tarik, like these are what kids are having nowadays. Computers are the thing. She's like, well, I don't know how to use it. And I was like, well, I don't know how to use it either. And she essentially was like, well, you better figure it out. And what that did was that really kind of spawned like my creativity, like debugging software. And let's be real, like the first thing I wanted to do was like learn to like install and play Doom 2. So, that kind of focused me on like understanding the deep tech of how operating systems work. And, if you want to use a mouse, for example, in Doom, you have to, what was it, modify like the autoexec.bat file, all that really fun stuff from like, Windows 3.1 and all that. And so anyways, like I really started to go down like the computer nerd route. And, growing up, I wanted to play more games, and games were still expensive when you were a kid. So you kind of jump into the software like scene, and, this is like pre-LimeWire, kind of LimeWire days where you're downloading games. And, so I've always been kind of like a traditional hacker at heart, building my own computers. And then I'm not going to lie, the movie Hackers was incredible. When I was a kid, I saw the movie Hackers. I thought it was so cool just to do like cybersecurity stuff, even though I didn't call it cybersecurity back then. And so it's always been this seed that's been planted inside of me of like cybersecurity hacking is just fun and cool, kind of sexy. And, over time, I didn't go to college. So I kind of had to learn on my own. And this is back in like the Barnes and Noble reading books days. We didn't really have YouTube. So it was a lot of self-study. And then like over time, fast forward, I was about, my early 20s, when I got an opportunity to join the Amazon SOC, the Security Operations Center. And this was a life of being a sysadmin and a network engineer. And I've always wanted to break into security, but I think there's two hard parts of a security person's career. The first part is just getting it. I think everyone can attest to like the barrier to entry is so stinking hard. And there's a lot of luck involved. I still to this day don't know how I managed to get in. I remember one of my first interview questions was, what's cross-site scripting? I didn't even know. And so, yeah, I had some folks took a chance on me and changed my career trajectory. I think the other hardest part about getting into like your other hardest part of security in your career is pivoting from IC to like a leader. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into security. And once you're in, you just kind of organically grow areas, despite the fact that I love the movie Hackers, I don't really do red team stuff. I've never done red team. I've always been a blue teamer, really focusing on the adversarial side. Threat intelligence is the biggest one that I've kind of carved, threat research, threat intel. But my background is heavy incident response and heavy kind of security operations and vulnerability management. So,
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. I think it's great thinking back to those days. I remember too when I had like a 900 megahertz computer back in the Dominican Republic when I was growing up. And like, yeah, my brother and I would download all sorts of stuff and computer would break and my parents would be like, why is nothing working? It was like, yeah, downloading games and stuff. That's awesome. No, but that's a good segue for like threat intelligence. So, I mean, I would argue that the cybersecurity problem space is largely a data problem, and in that there's usually, well, sometimes there's not enough data, sometimes there's too much data. And maybe why don't you talk a little bit more about like your experience in threat intelligence and what are some of the challenges with threat intelligence research?
great question. I agree with you. I think a lot of the threat intelligence space, I think where it succeeds is being able to provide context to that data that you talked about. So you have these, terabytes of data of whatever data set you're looking at. threat intelligence is really converting that raw data into like actionable intelligence. And I think when you talk about like what are some of the challenges, I think that's the biggest one is like number two things. Number one, how do you convert raw data into actionable intelligence at scale? And number two, the emphasis is on actionable. I think one of the challenges we have in threat intelligence is like, well, let me just automatically enrich like this raw data with like, threat intelligence sources from like Virus Total or Mandiant and blah, blah, blah. And a lot of like threat intelligence folks call it a day. They're like, well, I enriched it. Let me check this box and we're good to go. I think and this is why I'm so thankful I've been in the IR space for so long, is we understand the ramifications of bad quality threat intelligence. It could lead to rabbit holes, wasted time. And the purpose of incident command and incident response is we need to contain the adversary. The adversary is moving laterally through our network as we speak. They are exfiltrating data. They're laying additional footholds across the network. So having actionable, high quality threat intelligence is key to being effective in incident response. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to pivot from IR to threat intel is like, I understand the criticality of having that high quality threat intel. And so like how you get high quality threat intelligence, enrichment is a big one, but context is the most important thing. If you're looking at like, for example, an emerging threat, such as like a 0-day, you can enrich that advisory report with maybe some statistics of like, has this CVE been weaponized? Is it in like Metasploit? Is there a proof of concept in GitHub? How in the wild is this CVE? And those are great pieces of threat intelligence you want to know. But the context is the big difference maker. The context is, for a mature threat intelligence person, is to be like, what, are we even affected by this? Do we have the product? Are we vulnerable to the CVE? Are we affected by it? But like, what controls do we have in place? This like CVSS score 9+ might actually be a low risk to us, and the context there matters. And that's where I think like that is the crux of good threat intelligence for bad threat intelligence.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think in going back to earlier, you made the comment of like, you haven't spent as much time in red teaming. And I hear a lot from folks that work in red team, and they say a lot of the time you spend it writing reports. And I guess going back to threat intelligence in this context, is like a lot of time you may end up trying to find that context and doing maybe some manual. So maybe that's like a good segue to the next question. Is like, why is artificial intelligence particularly useful for automating this? Like, well, first of all, is that a fair assessment? Is that a fair statement? Is like, is the correlation of data and the addition of the context something that could potentially be automated? Maybe not in full, but in part. And why or why not? And where do you see this going?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I think LLMs can augment and help make more effective the inputs and outputs of threat intelligence. So for example, on the input side of the house, if we're consuming threat intelligence reports from third parties, sometimes these are like PDFs with like, 8, 10, 20+ pages with, images and tables. And there's a treasure trove of data. LLMs are really good. This is the RAG system where you can have, especially doing this at scale. So if you have one threat intelligence person who is kind of responsible for sifting through all these new threat advisory reports and threat intelligence reports as an input into their threat intel program, an LLM can really help you effectively process all of those. So if I have like 30 threat intelligence reports from all these various vendors, you can leverage a RAG to index those and like use some OCR magic and other pieces of technology to do really effective summarization. So, this is where a good prompt comes into play. And you could say, tell me, like in threat intelligence, we leverage the diamond model very often, which is, who are the victims? Who is the adversary? What are their capabilities? And what are their techniques? And if you feed an AI model like Qwen or Llama 3 with a good prompt, you could actually process these huge volumes of threat intelligence reports and actually have some So sustainable outputs that are a little bit contextualized depending on how you build your RAG system and your prompts. And you can have some really, this will like dramatically lower the amount of time you spend contextualizing and processing and IOC extraction and behavioral extractions. So this could really improve your effectiveness. Same with the outputs too. So like an output of threat intelligence, there's like your tactical threat intelligence reports and your strategic and your landscape kind of outputs. These are all for different audiences. Like a nice tactical report would be a cluster of IOCs associated with a threat actor that I give to like a threat hunting team. Like here's your hunt profile on adversary ABC, go to town. But when I'm writing like strategic reports, this is where LLMs are really going to be helping out. And they do today, which is, I have my raw threat intelligence report that I've written with, my TLDR, my summary, my IOC tables, all this really good stuff. But you can actually leverage an LLM to help you optimize that report. That's like the first step where you can tailor, like this is what I personally do, because a report is effective when you write it for the audience that you know. And one thing in everybody in threat intel knows is like every leadership individuals, they're all very different. Some leadership, they don't really want the details. Others that have different backgrounds love the technical details and they want more of it. This is where an LM could be like, hey, add more technical detail if you add that to the prompt. That's where it could be really valuable so you can churn out more effective reports based on the audience. Another thing too that I've been playing around with when it comes to outputs is tapping into your incident ticketing. So for example, for every incident that happens, you create a ticket or a case, if you will. Every company uses different terminology, but can you have threat intelligence outputs in terms of like the strategic and tactical reports by simply tapping into your incident response cases and almost in a RAG setup where your LLM is going through each incident that's already been completed and writing a strategic report for that as an output. That can save tremendous amounts of time too. So if your executive leadership was like, there was as you know, there was a major breach that happened to us. The dust is settled. We need to do a postmortem and talk about what went wrong. This is a really good opportunity for IR teams and threat intel teams to leverage an LLM to create these like postmortem reports, like what happened, when did it happen? Build a timeline of all the events that happened using this raw unstructured data or raw structured data inside of your ticketing systems. So I think LLMs are amazing for text summarization and writing. In my experiments for other use cases, it's a little bit of a mixed bag for other cases though. Like analysis work, I'm a little bit hesitant on. I'm still kind of playing around with that, but we could talk more about that too.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Maybe you can follow up with that one on like the new theme word, I guess, in the AI world is agentic AI, and what exactly does it mean? Like, could you have more specialized, optimize for certain workflows where you have like an agent that is just doing the summarization or one that's doing the correlation or one that's doing the analysis. But you also brought up like a lot of interesting things. One is I spent some time a few years ago working in communication surveillance, and part of the challenge there was communication surveillance for the purposes of private sector financial institutions to try to identify insider risk mitigation and things of that nature. One of the biggest challenges there was actually the quality of OCR, object character recognition, was not really there. And I think we have gotten like the floodgate has opened where there's not only a bunch of like really good large language models, but OCR has improved significantly. Cost of processing has decreased exponentially over time. So it's like, to your point, in a world where there's a lot of unstructured data, now it's possible to kind of make sense of it in a cheaper, easier way. But maybe let's follow up on the other use cases that maybe you haven't seen as much traction, or maybe it's because like the technology is still evolving. But like one, I heard an interesting interview between, I think it was Sequoia and Harvey, is like an AI company that's focusing on legal use cases. And one of the things they were mentioning is like, in order for them to remain relevant when a new base model release gets put out there, is that they need to focus on vertically integrating the workflows and the use cases. So maybe let's drill down into that analysis use case, like, could you elaborate, like, why is that particular use case not as effective so far, and could it be maybe it's just like a different architecture where having multiple specialized agents, for lack of a better word, would be a better way to approach a problem? And then you would like chain or like wire different agents for different workflows. How would that potentially work?
Yeah, totally. I think that my approach initially has been, let's leverage one agent for this work. So for example, I was playing around with Quen 2.5 and Llama 3.2 for analyzing URL strings. And because, for example, I was working on a SMS phishing campaign, and I was like, I can see with my eye patterns in the domain, in the TLDs, in the URL strings. I was like, I wonder if I through a large body of phishing URLs at an LLM and with the prompt effectively say, give me interesting trends in the URL string. I wanted it to have the goal of showing me what I already saw. Like, for example, the TLDs were XIN in all of them. I wanted to see this was an easy pass phishing campaign. And so there was permutations of easy pass and toll pay and all these words around tolls for driving and whatnot. And I wrote a LinkedIn article about it. The model outputs were pretty solid in terms of like being able to pick up those trends and patterns in the URL strings. And that's where I think it could be really beneficial for analysis. Although I think you can actually get much better quality if you leverage basic regex and pattern matching. But this is where we could segue into chained agents, if you will. This is where they can actually be a much better solution than just using a single LLM with one model. So for example, Crew AI is something I've played around with using different agents for different tasks with really good success there. So for example, I built a pipeline with Crew AI to say, number one, I had screenshots of these SMS text messages, and the first agent was like essentially a vision model that did OCR functionality. I was like, take this picture of an SMS phishing message and convert it to text and normalize it into a standard output JSON, because obviously I want to store it into a data store. And then the next one was a Llama 3.2 with the prompt of essentially saying, you are an expert in phishing, URL analysis, and NLP. Determine if this message is phishing, and then tell me why it's phishing, and also report that as a JSON output. And I've had a lot of success with Crew AI when it comes to structured outputs, which is key if we want to do AI or LLMs in the middle of our security solutions, right? Because if you don't, like, this is one of the problems I had with leveraging LLMs as a standalone without having like Crew AI, for example, is the outputs would change every time. And this is one thing I wanted to kind of also play around with and make a report on, which is like, what is the rate of hallucinations? The output's always going to be different. If you, for example, the prompt I gave was like, even with a template as part of the prompt saying, here's what I'm giving you, here's what I want you to do, you're an expert at this, here's the structure. The outputs are always different. So that's also part of the challenges there, is the structured output side. But I think the future is really around like Crew AI and those other kind of agentic frameworks.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super helpful. And I guess in working on that, I learned recently you open sourced a project called Jellybyte. Would you mind like explaining what's the origin story? Like, why did you start working on it? Was it in part like working with these other tools and creating these agentic workflows? And yeah, just can you elaborate like what it is, why you build it, and
Yeah, totally. Jellybyte is a project I'm kind of just tinkering on the side. Number one, I think here's the problem that I wanted to solve, which is everybody is dabbling in AI. Everyone's dabbling in LLMs. We're all trying to find where it works and shines and where it doesn't work. And one of the problems is oftentimes we have to deal with like third parties for LLMs. Like ChatGPT is a very awesome, low barrier to entry. My grandmother can fire it up and use it. But, for the threat intelligence space and security space, we need to be a little bit cautious about what data we upload to a third party. Like, This is just a classic example of leaking TLP data, whether it's TLP red. We just want to be a little bit cautious. So what I did was I built Jellybyte to be a purely localized, it's for the most part open source, depending on the models you use, and it keeps all traffic local to your machine. That way you can actually, as security people, play around with LLMs. It comes with a Jupyter notebook running. So Jupyter notebook as like the primary interface. I have OpenUI as the Open Web UI as the LLM manager. So as well as like a chat GPT style interface. Because not everybody wants to live and breathe out of a Jupyter notebook like I do. So having a traditional chat prompt with the ability to download and manage your models, super easy, super awesome. And then lastly, I have this optimized for GPUs. I think that's a critical piece too. There's a lot of these tutorials out there, they don't connect the dots and give you one holistic LLM environment. Or if they do, it leaks data to third parties, like, leveraging different, whether that's storing your data in a third party as your data store, or that's leveraging like an inference server that's a third party. Sometimes we want to play around with like really sensitive data. And lastly, like I'm also lazy. I don't like having to manually build things all the time, connect the dots. Sometimes I just want to do Docker, compose up, and just go to town. And that's kind of what Jellybyte solves.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I mean, what you brought up, I think, is a major concern. There hasn't been a lot of legal outcomes based on that, but to me, one of my fears is what you just brought up is saying, hey, if you're using a third-party inference engine, even if you are in a corporate environment and you have engaged in a commercial agreement with that organization, you're still kind of like going on a limb and like trusting that your data is still not going to the training pipeline. But there's no, I mean, from my perspective, and I've been researching this area and I'm curious to learn more if you heard differently, but it doesn't seem like there's like an auditable way to say, hey, show me all the data that I have fed as a commercial entity to your organization and prove me that from your training pipeline, none of my data made its way there. And when you're talking about like your infrastructure details, potentially credentials, potentially anything that I guess could be logged or be exposed in security data, that is extremely concerning and useful to have a local environment to play with, as you brought up.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you an example too. So I have ChatGPT that I have a sock puppet account for. And I used to pay for ChatGPT Pro. And I was using this for essentially replacing my search engine. So for example, I recently used this account to build a workout program. And part of the workout program was like talking about my goals. And part of the workout program is giving my gender and my weight and all these things that you need to when you're factoring in your health goals, right? And I've also asked it questions, like I live here in Arizona, and I was asking questions about like the local bunny population because we have bunnies all over the place, and I'm feeding it a lot of information, right? And then recently, I was asking ChatGPT about some a health question, and it was like, well, it returned as part of the prompt or part of the response was like, well, as a 41-year-old male that lives in Arizona and blah, 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 blah. And it was really eye-opening that it's a nice feature, but it clearly shows that they retain all data. They build a profile of the data that you feed it. They build a profile of you. And that is a nice feature, but also we have to remember, be cognizant of like, if you put the wrong things in those prompts or the sensitive things, it will be used as a profile against you. And that is part of like the risk acceptance model, right? And everybody needs to be just kind of aware of that. If you follow a lot of these online tutorials, just to like, hey, I want to jump in and learn LLMs, they're going to automatically, and these are like not only free tutorials online, but like your paid books on O'Reilly and these other sources, the first thing they want you to do is create an OpenAI key. And so they really want you to just start feeding data to it. And if you don't really pause and think about the risks involved, there could be, first off, there could be major legal implications for what you're doing. Your job is at risk, right? If you're uploading TLP red data about maybe a sensitive security breach you were involved with and you uploaded your threat reports or IOCs or whatever to your cloud LLM, that's a big legal risk to yourself too. So there's a lot of risk. There's personal risk, your job's at risk. I think that's where Jellybyte, and it's not a matter of plugging Jellybyte, but it's more like, I think we need to just be more aware of what data we're handling and where we're sending it.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, it just seems like edge computing or like local kind of inference. I mean, this also means that now there was a joke I was reading on X or Twitter recently. It was like about what is being GPU poor these days, and it's like the amount of compute that you need for what previously was like, oh, you're a machine learning engineer, or you are a game developer, or you just edit a lot of video, or whatever the case. But now, if you want to play around locally with these tools, you definitely need a lot more infrastructure. I think the other thing you brought up that's super interesting is I remember in the good old days, and that was only what 2 years ago when ChatGPT first came out, a big thing was like, oh, the context window is so small. The context window being like how the memory essentially for this large language model and chatbots. And well, now we don't talk about context windows anymore. But to your point, I think, yeah, anything that you feed it will eventually be correlated, and yeah, it'll come back to you in some way or another.
You're totally right. You nailed it. I mean, this is just kind of the agreement for any kind of free service on the internet. If you use any social media services, like it's not a secret, and it's not even an open secret, really. It's part of the user agreement that Gmail's a great example too. They index everything that you input into their platforms, not just Gmail, but all social media. Any kind of free service, it's all of your data is being indexed, profiles are being built with you from your data. And oftentimes it's used to help that company financially, whether they sell the data to advertisers or what they do with it, or train models off of it. That's another big one. So yeah, being hyper cognizant of your data and the data flow. I think there's always like the golden rule too, that if you don't pay for it, what is it? Like you're the product. I think that's still true.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, one on the last topic I wanted to cover was more about, and this is I think it's a hard question in general, especially because, as we said, I mean, in 2 years, the amount of progress, and it almost feels like every week there's like 2 and 3 new base models coming out and saying, hey, we broke every benchmark, and now this is the best possible large language model that's available. But just wanted to, from your perspective, and it can either be like specific to security use cases, threat intelligence, or just across the board, where do you see things going? Like, what makes sense to continue to invest in as an organization in using these tools? And where do you think you still maybe limitations and effort is best put elsewhere?
Yeah, I think LLMs and AI in general, for the security use cases it solves or could help solve, it's all very nuanced, right? So on one hand, I really encourage everyone to start experimenting with LLMs. How could you leverage those to optimize or make your teams more effective or efficient? I think there's a lot of nuance with that though. So for example, hallucinations are a real thing. Yes, over time they will be reduced, maybe, but that's one thing about threat intelligence and security work in general, especially with IOC. I gave a use case earlier of like, can we analyze threat intelligence PDF reports at a large scale and have a awesome text summarization of those? Like, give me the TLDR of these 30, threat intel reports. Well, what happens if that LLM misses a handful of IOCs or a specific behavior, and you send that report over to whoever your stakeholder or customer is? But maybe that one single IOC or behavior was the one that you needed a positive detection on, but your LLM straight up missed it. These are very real world risks. And so I'm a huge proponent of LLMs, but we also need to have a human review. That's what we call it at Meta's, like the human review, where you have a human in the loop still. I think that there are just tangible risks there, and having a human review the outputs of an LLM before it gets sent to production, for most use cases, I think it's generally still needed. Like, for example, if I took my threat intelligence report on a specific actor and I shoved it through an LLM to optimize it, make it more readable, more suited for a certain audience, I need to double, triple, quadruple check that at times, because not for spelling mistakes, but for inconsistencies and even hallucinations. For example, I've messed around, and this is kind of model agnostic, Quen, Llama 3. I've said, here's the prompt is, you're a threat intelligence expert, read this threat report, tell me what the MITRE attack techniques are for this specific adversary, and tell me any like regional information on them, like where they're from, etc. And each model had moments where it would fill in the blanks and just make up and hallucinate MITRE attack techniques. And like, wow, this has nothing to do with phishing lures, but you mentioned they used phishing lures. So that's really important for everyone. So I guess to summarize it, use LLMs, experiment with LLMs, but do it the right way where you have a human in the loop to kind of validate things. I think once you have a strong hallucination metrics down where you're like, hey, this model will hallucinate X% of times, as long as you factor that in, you may be able to have an LLM in the middle with good success.
No, that's great advice. I mean, another way to that I like, or an analogy that I like to use is that I feel like there's a lot of misplaced fear in that these tools are going to replace humans, where there depends on the latest headline is like LLMs are going to replace old software engineers or product managers or security engineers, and I like to summarize it as, well, each one of us has pretty unique training data. So if we think of ourselves as an agent or as a model, is like all the data from all your background from the time that you were installing Doom in your first computer to all the professional experiences that you have had is pretty unique training data that is not going to be available or necessarily available in the internet. And to that end, the very sensitive topics and industries are not always going to have, like, that training data is not going to be like a Reddit data set that you're just going to license or scrape or whatever the case may be. So we humans bring that unique perspective, and that each one of us has like our own label data set and training data set. And that's really what we individually bring to the equation. So hopefully that kind of like alleviates some fears and concerns. But I mean, to your point, I think the important part is to use these tools, understand them, because they're not going away. They're just going to get further and further integrated with every function in an organization. So on that amazing conversation, how can people get in touch with you, or you want to share any other projects or things that you have coming up, or just contact information, or how can they contribute to Jellybyte or any other projects that you have?
Yep. You could find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place where I post, either updates on Jellybyte or just my thoughts about threat intelligence and intersection with like enterprise and all that fun stuff. So hit me up on LinkedIn. If anybody would like to contribute to Jellybyte, there are no holds barred. Please contribute. I'm actually in the process right now of building a localized data lake for Jellybyte, leveraging DuckDB and Parquet files and all that stuff. So maybe it's a complete major overkill, but I don't care. It sounds kind of fun. So I'm going to do it. Yeah. So just follow me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for coming on the show and for providing a lot of great insights. And yeah, hope to catch up with you in person, hopefully at one of the conferences sometime soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thank you.